this week in perspective with me, Adam Simbe. On 13th of March, the Minister for Finance and Planning or Economics, Dr. Philip Mpango, presented at the seminar of members of Parliament in Dodoma recently the 2018-2019 budget proposals, and of course the plans from which the government has plans to spend 32.47 trillion shillings to be raised from both domestic and foreign resources, which is at which of course is an increase of 31.7 trillion shillings in the 2017-2018 budget. The government plans to focus on sectors and projects that will create a more conducive environment for the industrialization agenda. To discuss these proposals with me, Frank Duffer, representing the Confederation of Tanzania Industries. Next is Professor Prosper Ngowi, the usual panelist here, is Professor of Economics, Mzumbe University Business School in Dar es Salaam. Next, another usual participant, Dr. Brevius Kahyoza, economic analyst. The word social, usually I don't want to put it in there. And last but not least, Ivan Tarimo is a banking financial expert. I hope the four of you will help to analyze the budget for the benefit of the viewer. And I specifically wanted to thank you, Ivan, for participating for the first time. But I thank you all for coming to the program. Yeah. Now, let's start with the very first question, which may raise a few others as we follow up. What can you say, or usually I say, how do you characterize the budget proposals and plans for the financial year 2018-2019, Professor?
Thank you, Adam. You know, I've always done a lot of budget analysis for the past maybe 10-15 years, and my conclusion always is, once you have read actually one budget in Tanzania today, really you get the picture of all other budgets. So this year's proposed budget, 2018 and 19, indeed is really similar to what we have been seeing for quite a number of years ago. And now remember the broader context under which this is happening. This is the budget that happens in the context, in the broad context of Vision 2025. So it tries to really address some of the issues in the Tanzania's National Development Vision 2025. But it's also now, this is now the third budget in the fifth phase government. So it's again the third budget in implementation of the second 5 years development plan. So really there is a huge weight on industrialization in here, at least on the wording of the budget itself. But again, it is the budget being implemented, again, of course, in relation to ruling party manifesto, but also in relation to various sectoral policies, especially now industrialization policy, but also, of course, agriculture, you see those kind of stuff. Again, it's a budget which takes into context regional issues. First, global and regional issues. Global issues in the terms of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, but also EAC, East African Community, and SADC issues. I'm sure when it unfolds towards June, towards June, we are going to see issues of tariff, non-tariff barriers, issues of, common external tariff within the East African community. So I think
taxes as well.
Yeah, exactly. Taxes issues that will be exempted, issues that will be included in this broad perspective. Again, as I've said, it's really a budget like most other budgets in the broad picture, in the context that, of course, you have more funds going to recurrent expenditure than development expenditure, only that we are seeing a little bit of change. You know, we used it to have, before the fifth phase government, we used it to have like a 20%, 25% recurrent expenditure, 80%, 25% development expenditure. In the first budget of the fifth fifth first government, 2016-17, we saw really a radical change. We saw almost 40% development expenditure, 60% recurrent. Now we are going back almost to the normal, where we are seeing like almost 67% around recurrent, and 37, and the other percent now recurrent. So yes, but it's still more weight on the recurrent and less on development. We also seen really, that our tax revenues are not adequate really to fund all the budget, 50-something% of tax revenue. The other will be coming from aid, the other will be coming from loans, both domestic and foreign. So I think this is the broad context under which I could have, described the budget.
Professor, before I come to Doctor, thank you for explaining the budgets by saying if you can recall all the budgets, then this doesn't seem to be any diametrically different. Once you've seen one, you've seen all. Once you have read one, you've read all.
Yeah.
But just one specific question, this question of revenue, particularly domestic revenue, which is about 80-something. Is the element of borrowing within the country in there? Did you find this?
Yes, there will be, when it comes to revenue, there will be, of course, first, broad speaking, we say there is tax and non-tax revenue, more tax revenue than non-tax revenue. Within non-tax revenue, we have money that will be borrowed, and within borrowing now, there is external borrowing, there is internal borrowing, and then within broad context of borrowing, there is a commercial borrowing and, kind of an uncommercial soft loan kind of. So within domestic borrowing, there will be, somewhere the figures, there will be. And what have been the issue? The issue around the access of domestic borrowing has been, a possibility. I'm saying possibility. We aren't sure whether it's going to happen. Possibility of crowding out the private sector. That's where my friends come in. That's where Tanzania Private Sector Foundation will come in. The theory says if the government borrows a lot domestically, and I think now it's borrowing around 7% of the budget, something like that.
And where does it borrow? Where will it borrow?
Well,
traditionally the banks or what?
Yeah, essentially it will be borrowed from domestic financial institutions, broadly speaking, and of course within banks. If it can borrow from one specific bank. If it has to borrow in mass, huge amounts that one bank can't provide, Ivan will tell you, they have to do what we call now syndicated loans, but I'm not sure really how to happen. So yes, there will be domestic borrowing as it has been for quite a number of years, and now this, of course, may trigger debate on what we call now private sector maybe squeezed out of the market, those kind of stuff. But of course, it's good somehow to me when it comes to domestic borrowing compared it to foreign borrowing. Because yes, borrowing is borrowing, but then when you borrow foreign, mainly you borrow in foreign currency. When you come to repay, you use your local currency to repay the debt. So even if you have not borrowed more, just a mere weakening of the shilling, the exchange rate variability may increase the national debt, not because you have borrowed more, but just because you borrowed the foreign in foreign currency, and then you are going to repay by the tax money collected in T shillings converted into dollar. So yeah, you can see it's an area of debate really.
Okay. Dr. Brevis Kahioza, what do you say to the budget? You heard Professor first, eh?
Yeah, I think he has covered most of the areas that we would like to stick on. I think as much as we can cogitate on the way the budgets have been constructed in this country, as he has said before, you look into one budget, then you can know what will happen. But let's go into the specifications. I think this is the infrastructure budget, not different
this
from this particular one. Again, not far from what we had in the previous fiscal year, not very far from what we had 2016, 2017. But again, you look at where the importance of it comes in. I think it's quite true that when you have, in terms of planning, when you have such kind of a budget, instigating investment much more into the infrastructures like hydropower projects like that of Rufiji, we are told, like the SGR, then you are quite positioned, at least in terms of the geoeconomics of the area. You can, when you talk about, for example, President Uhuru thinking of the big four, they are almost gravitating on the infrastructures. And there is a reason as to why these governments are doing so. The same thing in Uganda, the same thing in Rwanda, the same thing in Ethiopia. So you can see that at least that is happening. On the other side, then you will have to go, I think, into the evaluation of what has happened in the last financial year. Now, there are tailwinds, we can say, in the previous fiscal year. We have seen the government trying, in a way, to improve the collections, of course, so that we can augment the fiscal space, of course, by curbing corruption and by reducing the tax evasion, is it? And then we have seen what has happened in that front. Again, you will see that at least the government has been also trying to scrap down the unnecessary spending, putting more spending on the development projects as we saw. But again, squeezing again the public sector payroll has come with its own consequences. Now, in discussing the current budget, how will it address that particular issue? And of course, being the tailwind. Again, we have seen from the monetary side, the government trying, of course, to loosen, I think, the monetary policies so that it can curb the liquidity constraint, thereby increasing, of course, what we have called the shrinking of the private sector in terms of lending. So these are the issues that you will have to associate with. But on the other side, you have the public debt. I think that comes on the headwinds, because as much as I said about the constraints that comes with the public debt, but again, the cost of servicing the debt is always dangerous, because at times it tends to cripple every aspect of moving forward in terms of development project. I think you have to look at, again, that if you look at the current account of our country, that of course, not professionally, but practically, you'll have to make that reconciliation. If you have the service, if the servicing of the debt is above minus 5% of the current account, it's like 11% of now, we have to get worried. And you look at the economy itself is depending on primary products. Now, as he said, once there is a shock on that, it disturbs everything in terms of what you are doing. So these are the, I think, the headwinds that we'll have to deal with. Of course, the non-performing loans has been a stumbling block. How will this budget, again, go into, of course, solving? Because one of the problems has been you do something better in terms of the monetary policies, but they have to match with the fiscal policies. And that's where the budget comes in. And why do we say so? Well, there has been, you know, at least from the financial transactions of this country, the government spends more. If it doesn't do that, as we have seen for the last few years, then there is a problem. If employments, for example, are shrinking because of the private sector and even the public sector itself, then the budget has to come in and do something. I would like to add something on when this government came into power, there was a sense that there will be the restructuring of the economy. And everybody was looking at how things will run. So the first budget gave the impression of that. As we move on, you can see that practically, at least, nothing has changed so much. If you look at the last year, last fiscal year, the same sectors that have been attributing towards growth are the ones championing the economy. Now, there's something wrong with that. If the budget did not address that particular problem, then poverty alleviation will be something that will be dealing with it as people still wallow in abject poverty, as data show today. So I think that has not changed so much.
Do you think, to cut you short, sorry, Dr. Kayudo, so do you think this budget is pro-poor in the context of what you just said?
No, I'd like to leave it to what Wole Soyinka says through the interpreters. But again, if you are to make a critical prognosis of what is really happening in the country, I think it's not pro-poor. Again, I do understand that many people would like to be politically correct nowadays. Everybody will say something in favor of what is being done, but actually, that is sycophants. That does not help anymore in this country. We'll have to look at the other aspect that introduced the area in terms of that being poor. I think the economy is constipating so much. This economy is constipating, and we have to.
It needs to get some anti-constipating.
Yes, because there are some issues that the economy is not. It is unable to digest it. There is a digestion. Why? Because you had a pool of plans, a pool of issues to put in, and they're all around the same, 1 year budget or 2 year budget, or the vision of what the government is doing. You look at the long-term perspective plan of development, look at the first 5-year plan, the second year plan that we are, and the third. You are seeing a sense whereby everything is brought in now in a budget of 1 year. That has consequences in terms of implementing the budget, and we have seen. Last year, you remember that the fiscal deficit, the year before this year,
yeah, that's 2017,
2016, 2017, you remember the fiscal deficit was about 4.4%. This current year is about 2.1%. And there are likelihoods, because of that constipation, that 2018, it may go to 4.4%. Now, if that happens, what happens then? There will be the skewness of the fiscal space, and that creates the fiscal hole, of which we are starting sensing. That's why you heard the minister saying, oh, yes, of course, 2.6 trillion will be coming from the donors. But again, he's skeptical if they will be giving that. That's why you have that framework that is led by Dr. Kaberuka, to see how that will help. So I think there are a lot of fronts to look at this particular budget, but I think much of what we have to deal with is about the economic constipation that our economy is wallowing with. And later on, I think if I get time, we'll have to see, when we say there has been growth, I think this is not a big news. If you were to look at our economy from 1988 to 2016, the relationship between growth and poverty reduction is another question that has not been asked. Why? I think there should be a lot of...
You mean it's not highlighted in the budget?
It is highlighted, but it is not implementable. Why? I think we'll have to look at the roles of the government in terms of dealing with this. I think it's high time that academicians, researchers will have to start questioning about it. And I know some people in the government know about it, but because of sycophants...
They will continue questioning, because you have started questioning for quite a number of years.
So you look, the last question I want to pose, I think we'll have to start, the professor will help us much more. If you have 3 areas whereby the government plays its role in the economy, say about macroeconomic stabilization, then you have redistribution of income, and the last one is resource allocation. Is it so much necessary to remain with the resource allocation to the central government in a way the tax policies are playing, that everything should go up and leave the local government in particular, whereby people live? Because what you're experiencing now is the fiscal imbalance, that you have functions to do, but you don't have the finances. And then that brings in the problem of fiscal equivalence then. And how do you solve this? Because there is a mismatch between the central government and it, of course, I don't say that it wasn't a problem before this government, it was, but now there is much pressure of which you have to look into that. And we see in a number of sectors, education, health, water, and a lot of those areas, Mr. Simbe.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You seem to share the same kind of not to concerns, but views expressed by Professor Ngowi. Let's hear from the private sector people, the Confederation of Tanzania Industries. You heard Professor Ngowi, you heard Dr. Kahioza, you must have read, and CTI has been participating in the discussions with the Minister of Finance in terms of preparing this budget, and you're still discussing on it. You made a presentation as private sector. So, do you think this budget is favorable to the private sector?
I would start with
private sector.
Well, alluding to what previous speakers have spoken, especially on infrastructure, I would say that that has been one of a major outcry for the private sector in Tanzania. We have been complaining of poor roads, poor energy resources, and all of this stuff, and even issues like compliance to pay tax. And in this budget, we see that first it's anchored in promoting industrialization, which is good for people in the private sector to hear. We would want such policies to be implemented, and we would want to realize such kind of sentiments. And also now looking at the way they have identified energy sector, agriculture, infrastructure such as road and standard gauge railway,
yes.
And they want to build on the budget that was allocated last year. So we think such measures would be good for business, and it will also reduce the cost of production, which is a hurdle to most of the private sector players. So I would say, which is, again, I'm not saying contrary to what my previous speakers have said, but the budget will also address some of the key issues that we think will be good for compliance and competitiveness of the private sector overall. Especially also, we see that the minister has emphasized on the use of ICT in the collection of tax. We think it will also reduce the current, issues that where we find the Revenue Authority and such other agencies that are collecting tax, they tend to base on enforcement than compliance. So we think such things as using electric systems to collect tax would reduce that kind of friction between, because now there is a friction between revenue collectors and businesses. But
you followed the discussion in the recent Tanzania Business Council, where the president was sharing, and he listened to all representatives from the regions.
Yes.
And I also followed it, but towards the end he was talking about TRA to be, to sit with the taxpayers, industrial, and all that, to see where they can harmonize areas that create problem, in terms of the private sector paying taxes.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes. And we are also looking forward to such things happening. I'm sure they will be better for business.
Yes, but at the same time, he said he's going to raise resources from within.
Yeah.
And those resources will have to come through taxation, isn't it, from Tanzania Revenue Authority. So if on the one hand you are asking Tanzania Revenue Authority to look back and see if they can not really eliminate, but can ease out the difficulties in paying taxes by the industrial, by the private sector, and it's the private sector which pays taxes. How do you reconcile this, Professor, before I come to you?
Yeah, I think there are quite a number of issues on taxation, and for the past 4 years I'm engaged in a research called Taxation, Institution and Participation. I'm doing it at Mzumbe, but we're also implementing in Angola and Zambia. Part of the findings that we are coming from Tanzania, which of course have included private sector. Issues include issues of, like a multiplicity of taxes, many taxes. But then for multiplicity and tax rates, indeed TRA is not to blame. It is just a humble servant implementing policies. So we tended to think that it is a TRA which is coming with the taxes. Now this has to go through to release the ministry. But also issues around taxation, issues of concern now include issues, for example, of the way tax is being collected. Really. And Mr. President, I think he came very clear on that really they have to be more, the customer service relationship has to be much better. But then there are a lot of issues on what we call, tax refunds, Therefore, I'm sure his members would come with issues where, TRI is sitting with, tax refunds, where taxpayers have paid taxes for quite a number of, in advance, but then they have to be refunded. Yeah. But now the question is, of course, once, I'm saying TRA, but actually at the end of the day, it's the Minister of Finance, when it sits with this all money, there is also called opportunity cost of holding money. When we are sitting with my billions, really it's an opportunity cost of money that could have invested somewhere. Because, there has been management, but we are paying interest. That's not really the point. When it comes to this particular issue, the question is the opportunity cost of you holding my cash. That is really the issue. But again, within taxation issues, and this is a broad issue, issues of policy predictability. Broad issues, predictability. I do teach managerial economics and teach what we call a long-term investment analysis. Any investor who wants to invest in this and in another economy, could be in Asia, Europe, Africa, wherever. Really the question of a policy predictability, broadly speaking, and within the fiscal space, taxation issues, how much am I going to pay in the short term, medium term, and long term is very important. And I think those are part of issues. In the mining sector, people are not sure whether, the policy environment, legal, regulatory framework will remain the same for quite a number of years. So I think those are part of issues when we're talking about the business environment, if you are to be frank, that really have to be ironed out in order really to give investors the confidence, to invest in this economy, thereby expanding the tax base and giving more revenue to the country. Because again, I don't like to go to the mathematics part of it, if you are doing the NPV, you are calculating the net present value, you have to do the sigma, you have to factor in the tax issue. Now, the tax issue is the long term. If I invest for the coming 10, 20, 30 years, I have to know that the tax rate, the figure that I'm putting on tax, has to remain more or less the same for real long term. Now, I think the question of policy predictability, it's an issue.
Is it possible to come up with a tax policy that is long-term, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, for example, when it comes to issues of, tax rates for long-term investors, yes. They could be really be accommodated within some agreement, within contract that I know. At least the band will range from here to here for the coming at least 5, 10 years. It's really quite possible. It's really quite possible.
Before you go to Ivan, then I would like to spend that particular point. Yes, it is true that policy uncertainty has been a big problem. But again, I think, as you say, to the ministry, I think the ministry has to look into its own perspective. There is a big danger, and I think that's where Ivan will come in. When you have the private sector that is driving the economy, and then you look at the monetary issue, for example, you play with the interest rates. Actually, the private sector is not comfortable only by reducing the interest rates, but you have issues like aggregate demand and economic growth, and that has to come from the fiscal policies of the government. We're talking about the Ministry of Finance in particular. This is happening, but it is happening slowly, and that means it will be eating up to any step you are taking from the monetary side. And Arion, you asked the question about borrowing within the economy itself. Once you have the net domestic finance, as we call, that the amount of money you're borrowing within is much higher, more than 1%, 2% of the GDP, as it is happening today, it will be inevitable for the private sector. I think it will be difficult for the private sector to survive. And once the private sector is not surviving, even if the tax policies are existing, you will not collect the revenues you want. And that's what we have been...
Because the business sector is the biggest taxpayer, isn't
Yes, that's what we have been fighting with. There's another area that's we're talking about, the PPP, in terms of how you will do that. But I think if we are to look at the economy broadly, the policies on the tax is a big threat, yes. But again, the way I think we play with particular variables on the macroeconomic stability from the fiscal perspective it's an area where we'll have to look at. And I would like to urge, I think, people responsible within the ministry in the coming budget, the members of the National Assembly, to study hard about it in terms of how they will be advising the one. Otherwise, we'll have good policies, we'll have good laws about the tax, but again, the practicalities on the ground will be that businesses should keep on thriving.
Yeah. Yes, it should keep on thriving. Now, Evan, it's your turn now. I'm sure you've been
where
waiting
to start?
for
I guess maybe let me start from where we finished off in terms of, can you reconcile more friendliness in tax collection with a need to collect more from the same area? Yeah. And I think absolutely. And in fact, that's more of what the solution that's being sought. So if we look at the framework that's been presented, the main three reasons of why the last budget had challenges, the main three challenges. Number one is tax compliance. So the ministry is saying it's still hard to enforce tax compliance. That is, the general public is not, being as compliant as perhaps we feel that they should. Number two, when we go out to lend commercially, the conditions are tough. Maybe rates are high and other conditions. And thirdly, donor policy and policy around aids and grants changes and fluctuates, so you may not hit your target. But keep attention to the number one, which obviously is also the number one issue on the private side. So here you have the number one issue on this side is that you're not paying enough taxes, or you're not, coming to the party. And on this side, it's perhaps the private sector saying we're actually being taxed maybe too much, and just the compliance is becoming a bit heavy on our industry. So certainly there, you can understand why the tones that were struck in the TNBC meeting was one more of to reconcile these two, which is more really what is needed now. Tanzania is currently 154 out of 190 countries when it comes to paying taxes. 2017 World Bank Ease of Doing Business. 154 out of 190. And definitely to sort that out, there needs to be, you spoke about the multiplicity of taxes, so you need to make it easier to pay, instead of, pay SDL, WCF, and then, that could be one payment that goes. So there are various issues that need to be addressed there. And that's why, whilst the framework for this budget is broadly the same with the last few ones, this is like part 3 of a movie that started 3 years ago. So each episode adds and continues on to the story. So this is very pro infrastructure. So which is a good story, and it's a continuation down the line. So the key thing is also reading the salient features of whether are there any lessons being passed from the first episode to the second episode to the third episode, and so on and so forth, so that overall full year development plan, specifically around the industrialization, is reached. And I think one of the main lessons is how to take a more tax-friendly administration approach. And I think that's very key to see if once the finance bill comes out, whether there's anything that will address this. It's not enough from the framework to see if it will. But certainly the tones that were struck recently from that meeting are quite encouraging. It was very refreshing to hear that for, I guess, most of the private sector. So we eagerly await the implementation of that.
As a bank and financial. Yes, please.
Now, you came up to something very good on lessons learned from one budget to another. Really, this is what I've been missing. And I should declare interest, conflict of interest. I've been partly advising the Parliamentary Committee on Budget for the past maybe 6 years or so, since Mr. Chenge's time and all this. And you read 1 year's budget. For example, when it comes to challenges, why last year's budget were not implemented, really the challenges that we've been reading for the past 10 years are more or less the same. Almost kind of a cut paste, really, So what does this tell you? It tells you really this is not a nation that learns. We are not learning, really, because if you are learning, challenges that we had last year, really we should have found a way of resolving it so that it does not reoccur this year. Even this year, I read it's 23 pages, 27 pages or so, exactly more or less the same challenges as to why 2017-18 budgetary goals have not been so much achieved. Exactly the same reasons. Now my question is, are we really learning exactly what Ivan is saying? And remember, if you are not a learning nation, we are in a danger to be, a laughing stock of the world, and we should not let this happen. We are too bright to let this happen.
Too bright, too big, too important to be left. While you're on it, and then I'll hear from the other panelists. So, overall, do you think this budget proposals, the budget, is it realistic? Is it achievable? These are the two words which I tend to love as a non-economist, and I can assure you, the four of you are all economists with basic, economics skills. Looking at it, from what you have said, Professor, what you have said, Dr. Kahioza, and what Frank said, and what Ivan has just said, do you think this budget is very realistic if you think that it has not taken into account the past mistakes? And Professor emphasized there that it seems we are a nation which doesn't
learn,
taking the learning, the experience of the past seriously. Is this budget seriously realistic and achievable?
I think that's where the rain starts beating us. At times, from what they have said, at times the budgeting process in this country, and in some cases to other countries in Africa, is that the budgets have been used as just as a way of attracting a valve and or a lifeboat, and to rid the current government from the political tensions, and at times to let the leader, at times to stay afloat, and then let things move. So that's a big danger, because we are not really touching the issues. It's good in our introduction, we have talked about the macroeconomic aspects of our economy and how the budget can work. But if you have to bring it down to the poverty question that the government is always singing, that everybody is always singing, I think a lot has to be questioned. And it has been made more than abundantly clear that if you have a budget, if you have the economy, that its variables are not really focusing on the grassroots, then you are left that economy to be controlled by the grasshoppers. Look at this. I said earlier about the local content of it, the local government in relation to the central government. We have been increasing budgets, for example, on health. We have been increasing the budget on education, budget on water, and so on and so forth. But for example, if you go into the health and education sector, whereby you can always improve the human capital, as we always say, you see these two sectors, education and health, have not been growing so much, despite the increase of the budgets. It's roughly 1.4% to 1.6%, considering any case of the two. Why? It's because few activities are taking place in those sectors. Therefore, they are not helping the poor. But again, if you look at in terms of how we make the budgets, I've looked in terms of the whole picture, considering the last 2 years. What budget do we need, for example, to sustain our needs on the health sector? It's not very clear. But again, you'll ask the second question. Does that budget, for example, in health, consider the epidemiological, for example, profile of that particular country? Then definitely not. Does that go hand in hand with the health status of the country we aspire? Definitely not. Does that consider the inputs in it? Definitely not. And then you have the budget that is focusing on the referral hospitals at the upper layer, and then you have many people on the ground. So I think we'll have to revise that, get a lot of money to the local governments, and that will help 3 or 4 things. One, fiscal decentralization. If you are not decentralizing the fiscal system, then there is a problem. You have the vertical imbalance that within the local government itself, there are problems of finances and so on, or you have the horizontal imbalances whereby the needs of people from Mbeya are not exactly the same with the people from Simiyu or the other part. So it will be talking about the national budget at the upper level. That does not reflect really what is happening on the ground. But again, there is economies and diseconomies of scale. What you want to do in a certain local government does not maybe require what you need to have from another area. But looking at that very big picture of the budget, and that has been affecting so much the credibility of the budget because of the overly ambitious budgeting at the national level. So I think to answer that thing, we'll need to go there. The last point I'd like to make is agriculture. I've looked at this budget, at this proposal. It is, it's disingenuous at times, saying that you can make people out of poverty with such kind of a budget in terms of agriculture. It is talking less about it. You're not considering about it. You say that you will have to, for example, increase in the 5-year development plan, as he said, alluded to the infrastructures like energy from the 1,500 megawatts to 4,900, so that you can champion, growth, and thereby so that people can have what we call the ripple effect to the poor. But again, the question about infrastructures are more or less the same of the colonial orientations. We have built roads. To what extent those roads have affected the prices of the commodities of the consumers?
We have 15 minutes, but maybe even less than that. Ivan, so the question of private sector involvement this time around, Frank can also join in. Do you think this is one of those priorities that we needed to address? As Professor says, we needed to, to choose. If we have 100, let's say we will handle 30, instead of trying to work very hard for 100, and which we can't even meet the commitments because the resources are not also there. How are the banks, for example, the financial sector, is it really progressing? Is it really stable? Is it really strong to support what the government is trying to do, even in terms of proposed budget? Very quickly.
Yeah, so private sector is very important. It's the goose that lays the golden egg, yeah? We don't want to kill it, certainly. Yes, from the banking perspective, I say, yes. So our industry right now is characterized by the following. So it is very resilient and strong from a capital point of view. Looking across the industry, it's average capital of around, I think, 18 or 19%, quite strong. There's a lot of liquidity right now at the moment, meaning banks in general are sitting with a lot of cash. And that you've noted, you've seen the drop in the interest rates.
They have a lot of cash. Then can I just walk in there and say,
now then we'll go to the next thing.
I need some of this cash because I'm hard up.
So the cash is there. Now, obviously, NPLs were high, record high 12.52 as of, I think, October last year. By November, it's down to 11.7. So could be some improvement, maybe it's some base effects, but we've also seen additional measures from the BOT. They've communicated new restructuring guidelines which will help the banks manage NPLs. So there is an opportunity for the banks to do something and to do more. One, because they have the cash and they have the capital. Now, they need the demand coming in.
That much cash?
So obviously, there have been some monetary policy adjustments or positions that have been taken over the last year or so, which have seen a lot of cash coming back into the banks. Number one is the change in SMR, statutory minimum reserve, from 10 to 8%. Yes. Very, very instrumental.
The last 4 days to even 8%.
No, SMR remains at 8. What's been reduced, the other one was the discount rate, which went from 16 to 12 and then to 9. I know there was something in the news yesterday about lending being at 11. That's not correct. There's no instituted lending by the authorities as far as I'm aware. So there's room to do more. So what's needed is more of that demand coming through the banking halls and saying, here's my contract, I'm part of SGR, I need so-and-so billions, give it to me, I need to go to the project. So that's why I think right now, maybe a bit contrary to the common consensus right now, I think this is actually the best time for the government to borrow more.
From the banks? From the commercial sector?
From the banks, locally offshore, through an infrastructure bond program that can raise 1 trillion shilling, 1.5 trillion, because the local banks have the money. Offshore banks also have the money. So you raise that amount of money, you do all these other projects, you've got SGR on the pipeline, you've got ECOP coming up, you've got Rufin, you've got so many projects, and all those have local contractors, have local industries, local people, local businesses being involved, and they knock on the banks, then they get the loan. So it's not so much as just leaving the money in the banking halls for people to come get it, but if the government can take it and do projects which will require people to come and find and work in those projects, then we get lending back up
and
again.
we create employment, my dear panelists.
Mm.
Do you know I have
contradiction whereby the government.
I have 5 minutes. I only have 5 minutes, and I'm sure it is less than 5 minutes. So, as usual, maybe the last point. I'll go this way, Frank. I mean, looking at the budget proposal as it were, and the discussions and the very fundamental issues that have been raised here, good ones too, and suggestions and what should be done and that. What will be, if any, 1 or 2 challenges that will pose for the implementation of this budget and, of course, the plans very quickly?
For me, I would foresee if we don't address the issues that have been raised across the table, collection would be very difficult, especially we know that over the years the private sector has been complaining of a very small tax base. My fellow here said the golden goose, but it's like the only one that has been squeezed and squeezed. So I think going forward, the private sector would really like to have less and less enforcement and tax burden upon them, and also a more relaxed approach on the consumer side, so that we can spend, I mean, people can spend more on what is produced locally, and we can raise the money at least to meet the target that the government has set.
Professor?
Yeah, I think, you know, because budget are 2 major sides. So when it comes to on the revenue side, really the challenges that have been seen are more or less those that have been seen throughout. When it comes to tax revenue, still really the tax base still remains really narrow. And of course, over the few years or so, I think, you know, the space has been shrinking more. We have seen quite a number of companies, industries, firms closing down, meaning that really eroding more of the tax base. To me, this is a bit of a worry. Now when it comes to expenditure, once you have collected, of course, you have to spend. There is again what we call you know, a disbursement rate, but burning rate, and you know, absorption capacity. Sometimes we send money, but then what happens is, for example, now from May, June, we are likely to see a lot of money being sent out. But now, ability to burn this money, to spend within these 2 months before we finish the financial year, is a problem. So I think we really need to build the capacity on how to use money.
Spend the money. I wish I could have all that money and with my capacity to spend it, but I don't have it. Now, very quickly, one challenge times really up.
I think they're the same. I think the performance of the budget will not be much higher than what has happened. I think the fiscal deficit would be higher than it was the last year. It will be more than 3.7% as we see. But the second thing I think we'll have to look at, I think the government should purposely move from the pure economic thinking of the budget and they go to the political economy part so that it can tackle the poverty problem by linking the economic growth on one side and then discarding poverty. If we don't do that, I think the budget will be a playing game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you asked if the budget was realistic or not. So unfortunately, I don't think that's a yes or no question. It's more a scale of 1 to 10. By January 2018, we were at 85% against the targets. So it's more of that sort of a scenario. So if the new budget, because it's only increased by 2.4%, more or less like may perform at least 85% or better. So that's in terms of achievability. But certainly, I think the elephant in the room with regards to the budget is the revenue. 64% is taxes. And there, I think the pen is mightier than the sword. Now, if it's the lawmakers, it's the finance bills, the Ministry of Finance, we need to continue to engage private sector to see what other creative ways we can collect more taxes, make it easier to pay taxes, and they will inevitably collect more.
Since you're a banking and financial expert, sorry, I should have asked this question as a follow-up. There are all mama's cries that there isn't enough money circulation in people's hands. I mean, that's why there's a complaint that life is difficult. Do you think money circulation is limited or is no longer there?
Well,
is it adequate or enough?
Well, perhaps then that question is more really on a fiscal, in terms of what sort of government expenditure, what's been the pattern, what's been the arrears and things like that. Is that money coming back into the system fast enough? I can certainly tell you by many metrics on the banking sector side, banks' liquidity is very high. They've got a lot of cash, and the system's got a lot of cash. And therefore, it's there to lend. We need the productive, we need the reasons, we need the demand, we need the project for people to come and lend against, to borrow against, and to drive the economy.
I know I should wind up, but Professor, I give you the last chance because it's aching me. Reading the Controller and the Auditor General reports in previous years during the fourth phase administration, there were complaints that local government authorities are the biggest culprits of misappropriating, if this is a correct word, of the budget allocation. They are not spending this money properly, and they found holes in this. And yet, Dr. Kahyoza says this is where all the money should go. If they can't spend the money, again, as you said, the capacity to use it, why should all the money go to them? Just because they are the people on the front line with the Tanzanians?
No, I think, as you said correctly, what happens is most all the projects really, at the end of the day, will happen in a local government authority. You could see, for example, the Tanga Uganda Railway is going to pass in of, I think, 24 districts or something like that, 184 villages. All those are local government authority. So really, at the end of the day, that's where things are going to happen. Now, I think part of his concern he's for decentralization, but then we are seeing centralization. For example, when it comes to revenue, property tax now has been highly centralized, removed from local government to the central government. Now, this, of course, partly makes this finance not available to the local government. But again, as you correctly said, when it comes to expenditure, really there is a need to make sure that, local government authorities given this, we build what we call the absorption capacity to really use the money that will be going through it. However small it is.
Well, my panelists, I thank you very much for your contribution to this very important and very basic subject. I mean, it affects everybody in the country. I mean, I should have asked, for example, either Bravias, Dr. Kahyoza, or Professor. So what is really a budget? I mean, based on what all people, what we have said, what is the budget and what's the purpose of the budget? But that's a bit taken by events in the terms of your discussion. So the ideas are very good, and I hope the powers that be who follow this program, and I believe they do, will take into account your views from the private sector, Professor views, as you correctly said. You do provide guidance to the Finance Committee of the budget. So this will have to go back to the budget, to the Bunge, to the Parliament. So you are likely to meet this budget committee before and provide them with the appropriate advice on how to look at the budget, to scrutinize the budget. And Dr. Kahyoza said the budget should be very serious, the Bunge, to look into these things and link up with what is really important in terms of priorities and fundamentally the people out there, poverty, hunger, whatever. Thank you very much, Ivan, for your contribution for the first time, which I think was very powerful. And you benefited the viewers out there. So viewers, you heard the views of my panelists here. I don't have to add anything. My conclusion is that they're very powerful ideas, powerful contributions. Let us wait and see whether the budget will sail through in the Bunge, and wait and see whether the government will be able to raise domestic revenue and whether it will be able to get these external sources from the development partners, which has been always a problem. They make commitments, but implementation of the commitment has always been difficult. So thank you very much, my panelists, viewers. That's it, and this is all we can give you today until next Sunday at 21 hours, and on Thursday at 15 hours for the repeat program. On behalf of my very able panel, Frank Dafa, Professor Prosper Ngowi, Dr. Bravias Kahuza, Ivan Tarimo, and my TBC Television Center crew. Thank you, viewers, and goodbye.